Madhulika Kumar. She has completed her Master of Architecture in Architectural Association, London, UK. She then went on to work at Shanmugam Associates and integrated design on projects ranging from residences to regional planning, sustainable master planning, water calculation, etc. She was also known for her master thesis, which was selected for public display at AA, which was also selected for summer exhibition and shortlisted to publish at a national conference in UK.
Welcome to UGC lecture series for BE Architecture. Today's subject is Sustainable Planning and Architecture, Unit 2, Ecosystem and Food Chain, Lecture 3. So, the presentation is divided into 3 parts. First, the introduction, and second, we are going to discuss about ecosystem and then food chain, and we are going to see the interconnection between these two and then the conclusion. So, what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem includes all living things, plants, animals and other organisms in a given area interacting with each other and also with their non-living environments, weather, earth, soil, water, sun and atmosphere. So, what I am saying is, in an ecosystem, it is an interaction between living and non-living things. So, it happens in a day-to-day life, and as we come across, we can see like how sun helps the plants to create photosynthesis, and by photosynthesis it creates its own food, and living organism like cows are dependent on the plants, and then we are dependent eventually on both plants and animals for our own livelihood. So, ecosystem simply means ecological system. Ecology is the study of ecosystem. So, going into detail about ecosystems, there are different scales. So, first let us see how it works in a smaller scale. So, consider a small puddle at the back of your home. In it you may find all sorts of living things from microorganisms to insects and plants. These may depend on non-living things like water, sunlight, turbulence in the pool, temperature, atmospheric pressure and even nutrients in the water for life. So, as you see in this picture, the sun which is present in the right side is creating sunlight which is used by these plants to create photosynthesis, and this is eventually giving out its energy as in the form of food for insects and other organisms like snails and frogs which are using the water for its livelihood. And then these water and animals we are dependent on them. So, even the small insects like tadpoles, flies, water weeds are being interconnected with this ecosystem, and whenever it gets disturbed, and a whole different scenario happens which disturbs the entire nature of this pool. So, anytime a stranger, living thing or external factor such as rise in temperature is introduced to the ecosystem, it can be disastrous to that ecosystem. This is because the new organism or factor can distort the natural balance of the interaction and potential harm or destroy the ecosystem. So, what they are saying is, if anything strange organism or external factor say such as rise in temperature occurs in that ecosystem, it may destroy. So, as we saw in the earlier picture, consider this same poodle as an example. So, if there is a rise in temperature and this water gets completely drained off, so in that case the fish eventually dies and the tadpole which is present within the pond also dies, and then this will not have any water for the water weeds to grow, and which will eventually make the frog and the snail starve. So, this everything is interconnected. Even though it is a small factor, it is extremely important in this ecosystem, and we cannot eliminate even one factor which or neglect it as less of an importance. So, usually biotic members of an ecosystem together with the abiotic members depends on each other. This means the absence of one member or one abiotic factor can affect all parties of the ecosystem. So, what they are saying is, like biotic factors or living things which is like plant, snail and water weeds and everything. So, abiotic factors such as environment and the gases present around it, sun, solar radiation, everything comes under abiotic, non-living organisms. So both are interconnected with each other, and even one cannot be neglected. Unfortunately, ecosystems have been disrupted and even destroyed by natural disasters such as fires, woods, storm and volcanic eruption. Human activity have also contributed to the disturbance of many ecosystems and biomes. So we know by natural disaster and calamities how much a place can be destroyed. So consider the recent floods that's been happening here, so which is reducing the ecosystem and disturbing the ecosystem, which takes months or even years to restore to its back to actual form. So suddenly increase in water or temperature might kill all the fishes, which might look like a small thing, but it will affect on a larger scale on the overall ecosystem of aquatic creatures. So looking further into biotic and abiotic factors. So as we told before, abiotic factors are living examples such as plants, animals, fungi and bacteria. So these are the ones which create their own food with the use of abiotic factors, which are non-living examples such as water, sunlight, soil, air and temperature. With the use of sunlight, plant produces photosynthesis and plant lives with the help of water, and due which plant also needs soil for its to stay, and then plant also takes air which has carbon dioxide, and it needs an ideal temperature for it to grow. So this plant is eventually been eaten by animals and decomposed by fungi and bacteria. So scale of ecosystems. Ecosystem come in indefinite sizes. It can exist in a small area such as underneath a rock, decaying tree trunk or a pond in your village, or it can exist in larger form such as an entire rainforest. Technically, the earth can be called huge ecosystem. So we cannot define ecosystem as a definite scale. So it's completely indefinite, and it can happen in numerous numbers on different scales, like just below the tree trunk or under a rock, or we are all also a part of ecosystem. We are all on the larger scale, even on the rainforest an ecosystem occurs. So it's a combination of different small scale which can form an indefinite scale of an ecosystem. So as you see in this picture, so in a decaying tree trunk, you have the humidity as in the atmosphere, which makes this tree to form fungi. So these fungi and ants and the rodent matter and other insects such as frogs and snakes are also present in this area, and there is a interaction between these things which forms the abiotic organisms, and which is dependent on non-living organisms such as humidity, sun and temperature. So let's see how these 5 members relate to each other in the tree trunk ecosystem. So humidity, which is an abiotic factor, provides moisture for the tree to decay. So the tree trunk is depending on humidity to be able to decay. So as we know, so when the tree decays, there is a lot of humidity present. When we touch a tree which has been decayed, we can feel that it's completely wet. So it happens due to the presence of water content in the air, so which is humidity. And then the decaying trunk provides fertile grounds for the tiny green plants to grow. So when there is humidity, naturally the smaller plants, and you can see even in between concrete floorings, you can see small cracks which is forming small plants to grow, which is due to the humidity which has been present in the ground. So it's likewise the same happens in decaying tree trunk, and then tiny green plants become food for bugs and insects that live around the tree trunk. So as we said before, since these plants are growing, it becomes as a food for the bacteria and smaller insects which is being present, and due to the humidity content around the tree. And then bugs, insects become yummy food for smaller animals like frogs. So we must have noticed in a decaying tree there will be lot of frogs, snakes, snails. It's all present because there is a lot of food from the smaller planets which has been growing due to the other two factors that we discussed before. The frog becomes dinner for the big snakes hiding under the tree. So we might have also noticed snakes which has been feeding on the frog, which is eventually dependent on other factors. So which all these are part of the ecosystem which is being found under the decaying tree trunk. So there you go, you will notice that if one member is taken out, the entire relationship will be affected. Example, if a fire burns out the tree trunk, the insects will starve to death, and the frog will have no food, and the snakes will have to go somewhere else to look for food. The ecosystem will be no more. So as we told before, let's say if the tree has been caught up with fire and everything completely dries out. So what will happen is the humidity doesn't exist anymore, and the plants and the small insects which were present in the tree due to the humidity, everything completely gets destroyed. So the other organisms such as frog and snake which has been eating on the smaller planets which has been created due to the other factors which is no more present. So they cannot be there because there is no food. So they will start eventually moving out in search of food to some other ecosystem. So this ecosystem will not exist at that time. To make things simple, let us classify ecosystem into three main scales. Micro, a small scale of ecosystem such as pond, poodle, tree trunk, under a rock, etc. So in a micro scale, as we discussed before, like a decaying tree or a small pond in which you can see smaller insects and few other organisms such as the snails and frogs which has been depending, and there is interaction between each other. So that is been classified as micro scale of ecosystem. So meso scale is a medium scale ecosystem such as forest or large lakes. So meso is like a medium scale of ecosystem in which it happens with more number of organisms compared to micro scale which has been very small and finite. And when we go to meso, it's even a lot of other abiotic and biotic members get involved, which makes the scale even much bigger. So as we see on a large pond or a forest, so first everything starts with climate. So the climate which has been interdependent on plants, and plants which has been present due to topography and soil, and because of plants there is animal. So we cannot take any one of this element from this ecosystem because it will destroy the ecosystem completely. So this comes under meso scale of ecosystem. So moving on to biome, a very large ecosystem or collection of ecosystem with similar biotic and abiotic factors such as entire rainforest with millions of animals and trees with many different water bodies running through them. So as we know, this rainforest and deciduous forest which has been present around the world, which covers a lot of acres of area, which has lot of different varieties and different species of animals and plants which has been interconnected with each other, and also everything becomes an important part of this ecosystem. So even if one thing is spoiled, the entire ecosystem gets spoiled again. So this happens in a larger scale like tropical or deciduous rainforest, trees and forest. So individual is a smaller scale, it is a finite, and the population includes a collective of individuals which also forms the biome, and then the community which is different categories of different species which is being involved by the population, which forms different communities. Like for example, when you see this picture, you can find different animals which has been running around, which forms like different communities which form a group of lions, a group of tiger or a owl or deer and all this. Let's see, so it has the environment and this community which is a part of this population and which is an individual as well, which is connected by the environment, sunlight and air, and this everything is together forms a biome which is on a more of a country level ecosystem, and this is a part of biosphere which is the entire earth. Ecosystem boundaries are not marked by rigid lines. They are often separated by geographical barriers such as deserts, mountains, oceans, lakes and rivers. As these borders are never rigid, ecosystem tends to blend into each other. This is why a lake can have many small ecosystems with their own unique characteristics. Scientists call this blending ecotone. So, you cannot consider a large forest or a lake in which there is a lot of smaller ecosystem which has been happening. So, you cannot put a boundary, this ecosystem will happen only at this area and this ecosystem will happen only in this area. So, it is more like a dynamic thing which happens even if there is no food in one ecosystem, one species might come to the next ecosystem. So, there is no specific region or a boundary which can separate this. There is a lot of transition ecosystem which happens too. So, this is being called as blending ecotone. Ecosystem can be put into two groups if the ecosystem exists in a water body like an ocean, freshwater or pool. It is called an aquatic ecosystem. Those that exist outside of the water body are called terrestrial ecosystem. So, ecosystem has been divided into two categories, which is like aquatic water system which happens in the water within the water community, more like water weeds and plants which grow within the water, the water snakes and water weeds, tadpoles which is present only in the water usually and cannot come out. And there is other ecosystem which has been divided in, is called as terrestrial ecosystem, which happens outside the water body, like the ecosystem which happens within a forest or a much bigger scale like a biosphere. All this comes under terrestrial ecosystem. So, as you see, this is a pond which shows different ecosystem. So, if you consider this has an aquatic ecosystem, there is interaction between these elements and which is called aquatic ecosystem, and then land ecosystem is the plants and trees and other animals which might be present only in the land. But when you compare these animals such as tortoise or a frog which can stay in even in land and also in water. So, this forms a transitional ecosystem. So, they can depend on both their ecosystems in aquatic or land ecosystem. So, this transition ecosystem is called ecotone, which usually happens in marshlands. So, levels of organization in an ecosystem. To understand the level of the belonging in the ecosystem, let us consider the diagram below. So, this happens in individual level, population, community, ecosystem and biome and biosphere. So, now let us see how everything is interconnected. So, individual, species or organisms. So, an individual is grown living things or organism. Individuals do not breed with individuals from other ups. Animals, unlike plants, tend to be very definite with this term because some plants can crossbreed with other fertile plants. In the diagram above, you will notice that Jill, the goldfish, is interacting with its environment and is only crossbreed with other goldfishes just like her. So, when you saw this picture, this is an individual which shows this, there is one fish which can interact or crossbreed with the same fish which is of the same category, again like a goldfish, and this forms an individual ecosystem. When we move on to population, a group of individuals of a given species that live in a specific geographical area at a given time. So, example is this fish and his family and friends and other fishes of the same species. Note that the population includes individual of the same species, but may have different genetic makeup, as we see like hair, eyes and skin color and size between themselves and other population. So, when you move on to population, it is still the collective individuals which form the population, and it does not include anything from the outside. So, it cannot include say a jellyfish or a catfish which is not its own breed. So, this population, everything may not be the same, like humans, we are all different, each one is different. The same way it happens in other species also, like considering this fish. So, now moving on to the community. So, community, this includes all the population in a specific area at a given time. A community includes population of organisms of different species. In the diagram above, note how population of goldfishes, salmons, crabs and herring coexist in the definite location. Great community usually includes biodiversity. So, in a community, as you see in this picture, there is a lot of other individuals from different communities which has been interacting, and it forms a ecosystem involving different species. So, now when you look at this picture, it has plant, goldfish, scorpion and a jellyfish and some other fish which from a different community, and ecosystem. So, ecosystem, as explained in the pages earlier, ecosystem include more than a community of living organism which is abiotic interacting with the environment which is biotic. At this level, note how they depend on their abiotic factors such as rocks, water, air and temperature. So, when you look at this picture of this ecosystem, so there is different communities. So, as you compare this picture to the earlier one, you might not find this presence of water in the previous picture, which shows this biotic factor which is water, which is a non-living organism, which is very important for the fishes and other organisms to survive. So, moving on to biome. A biome in simple terms is a set of ecosystem sharing similar characteristic with their abiotic factor adapted to their environment. As we discussed earlier, like biome is more of a large scale of different ecosystems happening together with members from different communities put up together too. So, as you see in this picture, you can find different ecosystem which has been happening, which together forms a biome. So, see, when you see, this might be one ecosystem and this might be completely another ecosystem which is not dependent. This fish will be interacting only within this area and this will be interacting within this area. So, these are like collective ecosystem which has been happening which forms a biome. So, moving on to biosphere, which is on a larger scale. So, biosphere, when we consider all the different biomes, each blending into the other, will all human living in many different geographical area, we form a huge community of humans, animals and plants in their definite habitats. A biosphere is the sum of all ecosystem established on earth. So, as we seen in the previous slides too, so when we move on to biosphere, it is a collective of different biomes which forms different ecosystem which are interdependent on each other. So, we also are a part of this ecosystem and biosphere. So, not one of the species can be neglected or considered as less of an importance. That is why even when different species are becoming extinct, government make different policies and awareness to save these tigers and leopards to save this ecosystem. So, we may not be sure what type of an hazard it will bring to the ecosystem at final if they are extinct. Quickly, when we look at what is biome, biome are very large ecological area on the earth's surface with fauna and flora, which is animal and plants adapting to their environment. Biome are often defined by abiotic factors such as climate, relief, geology, soil and vegetation. A biome is not an ecosystem, although in a way it can look like a massive ecosystem. If you take a closer look, you will notice that plants or animals in any of the biome have special adaptations that make it possible for them to exist in that area. You may find many units of the ecosystem within one biome. So, as we discussed before, like a biome is a collective of different ecosystems which has been happening, and even in your day-to-day life, in your garden or a pond very close to you, you will find different species which is being dependent on that location, specifically to that climate and weather conditions. Say for example, there are certain tropical animals which can be which is available only in the tropical regions of this planet, and it cannot survive in different conditions because the temperature and the climatic condition is completely different, which is not they are designed for. So that's how the biome is formed. So there are 5 major categories of biomes on Earth. In these 5, there are many sub-biomes under which there are many more well-defined ecosystems. So moving on to food chain, all living things need to feed on, get energy to grow, move and reproduce. But what do these living things feed on? Smaller insects feed on green plants and bigger animals feed on smaller ones, and so on. So as we discussed before, so this animals feed on this plants and plants get their energy from sun, and we are dependent on both plants and animals for our to get the energy to grow, reproduce and to move around. So this feeding relationship in an ecosystem is called a food chain. Food chain, or usually in a sequence with the arrow used to show the flow of energy. So as we see this sun produce energy which is necessary for the plant to grow, and the plant is creating its own food, and the snail is been feeding on the plant, which takes its energy and helps it to grow. And as we know, snails are usually eaten by frogs, and the frogs are eaten by snakes, and finally the owl which eats the snakes. So it's like a food chain. So these are the elements which cannot produce their own food, and they are dependent on each other for their own growth and reproduction. A food chain is not the same as a food web. A food web is another network of many food chains and is more complex. See the food web illustration below. You can pick out the basic food chain from the food web. Green plants, grasshopper, frog, bird, hawk. So food web is a collective of food chain which has been connected to each other. So energy transfer. So energy transfer is when food chain happens, like how energy is being transferred from one element to the other, and the remaining is given to the biosphere. So if you can see this picture, you will find different energy which is being transferred and different energies which is being lost to the environment. Tropical food chains. So the tropical food chain is the level of food pyramid at a tropical level. So the tropical level of organism is the level it holds in the food pyramid. So these are different levels of food chain at a tropical level. As you see, sun which is being dependent, and the energy gets transferred from smaller level to higher level. So for this food chain to produce, there are producers and consumers. So producers are basically the species which produce their own food, and consumers are the ones which are dependent on the producer for their growth. So as you see in this picture, so the sun is the source of all energy in the food chain. Green plants, usually the first level of food chain, absorb some of the sun's light energy to make their own food by photosynthesis. Green plants are therefore known as producers in the food chain. So again, it explains the consumers, which are the second level. These are completely dependent on green plants. Animals in these groups are usually herbivorous. So as we know, animals which are like insects, sheep, caterpillars and even cows. So this shows ecological pyramid, like producers in the first level, and herbivorous which is dependent on the producers, and secondary consumers which is dependent on primary consumers, and then finally tertiary consumers. The third is the food chain or secondary consumers. These usually eat up the primary consumers and on animal matter. They are commonly called carnivorous. An example includes lion, snakes and cats. The fourth level is called tertiary consumers. These are animals that eat secondary consumers. So these are how this entire ecosystem is connected with the food chain and how energy transfer is happening. So you can look at this picture. So quaternary consumers are not in all food chains, but these are they can eat the tertiary consumers basically. Carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle is very important to all ecosystem and individually life on earth. The carbon cycle is critical on the food chain. So during the food chain process, carbon dioxide is very important, which forms this carbon cycle. So basically in the air and the atmosphere that's present around us, carbon is a gas which is present, So, living tissues contain carbon because they contain protein, fats and carbohydrates. The carbon in these living or dead tissues are recycled and various processes. So, when you see this picture, its carbon is present in the environment, which has been taken, observed by the plants, and which has been again, this is the food cycle, and living organism like human beings or like animals, they all give out carbon dioxide, which has been let into the environment, and again it is absorbed by the plants. So, it is like a cycle. Learning outcomes. So, first, as we discussed, we saw introduction to ecosystem and different scales of ecosystem, level of organization in the ecosystem, introduction to food chain, and we also discussed about energy transfer in the food chain, and carbon and nitrogen cycle, and some important terminologies which has been discussed within the presentation. So, questions: what are the scales in an ecosystem? What are biotic and abiotic components? How are we part of a food chain? What are the different cycles, and brief about carbon cycle? What are the levels of consumers in a food web? Define habitat in a food web. Thank you.